Have you ever felt like the basic systems running society are just glitching?
Oh, constantly. Yeah.
I mean, you look at public health or data security, local courts.
Right. It feels like the wheels are coming off a bit.
Exactly. It's like that fundamental social contract that you signed up for is failing, and the architects of the system basically have no idea how to rewrite the code.
Yeah, it's a really pervasive anxiety right now. I mean, you read the news, you look at all these municipal failures, and that underlying sense of vulnerability just, really sets in. The guardrails that we assume are governing modern life feel increasingly, well, theoretical.
They really do. And that is exactly why, for this deep dive, we are opening up a highly complex, honestly incredibly dense stack of sources.
It's a massive amount of material.
It really is. It's centered around this master plan and a draft legal document. And it weaves together like historical cyclical theory, biological identity, and this real-world legal battle that is currently playing out right now in early 26 in Seattle.
Right, so we are looking at a very real paper trail here.
Mhm.
Court filings, regional zoning laws, and a philosophical manifesto that points to a very radical legal strategy.
And the mission for our analysis today is to explore what happens when institutional distrust reaches a terminal velocity. Like, what does that actually look like on paper?
Well, we are examining how one individual is leveraging these ancient hereditary claims alongside some truly unprecedented legal loopholes to essentially attempt a de facto secession from the modern state.
Which is wild.
It is. It is an extreme stress test of municipal, state, and federal jurisdiction.
So to understand the sheer scale of what this document is attempting, we first have to look at the justification. I mean, the author is basically declaring a paper war on the system,
Yeah.
right? And they start by outlining what they call an arc of instability. And they aren't relying on conspiracy theories here, which is interesting. They're citing documented modern structural failures.
Real headlines.
Exactly. They point to events where 1.6 million residents had their unemployment data breached.
Yeah, that was huge.
Right. And they cite regional health crises with like 1,000% surges in disease.
And they also meticulously document the breakdown of the judiciary itself, which is a big piece of this.
Right, the courts.
Yeah. The sources highlight cases being dismissed purely due to sheer procedural incompetence. They point to actual headlines declaring things like, INSLE is incompetent, or situations where law enforcement officers are seeking anonymity to avoid political fallout.
Wow.
Yeah, the authors build in this foundational argument that the state is no longer a provider of order, but an active source of chaos.
And he maps this systemic decay directly onto the Strauss-Howe generational theory.
Right, the turning cycles.
Yeah. According to his analysis of the current timeline, we are at the end of an 80 to 100-year cycle, which is called a seculum.
A seculum, yes.
We are transitioning out of the third turning, which is the unraveling, marked by weak institutions and hyper-individualism, and we are plunging straight into the fourth turning, which is the crisis.
And the mechanics of a fourth turning are crucial to his legal strategy here. In a crisis period, public trust in centralized authority basically drops to zero.
Right.
The state ceases to be viewed as a mutual benefit corporation and becomes perceived as this incompetent quasi-governmental encroachment.
Yeah, it becomes a burden.
Exactly. The author argues that when the central authority loses its ability to protect data, manage health, or administer justice, its underlying contractual authority evaporates.
Here is where it gets really interesting to me. It is essentially like an air-gapped operating system.
Okay, how so?
Well, you realize the state's code is corrupted, right? Your data is exposed, the apps keep crashing.
Right, total system failure.
Yeah, and instead of waiting for the original developer to send a software patch that you know is never coming, you intentionally cut the Wi-Fi. You sever the connection entirely and just code a brand new, highly localized operating system from scratch.
That is a great analogy. And the historical notes in the document actually prove this is not an isolated digital era phenomenon.
Really? Like that this has happened before?
Oh, yeah. The author parallels our current glitching system to the late 19th century, specifically the Gilded Age between 1870 and 1900.
Okay, so a long time ago.
Right, but very similar conditions. During that era, rapid urbanization completely overwhelmed municipal infrastructures. Cities literally could not manage basic sanitation, leading to horrific cholera outbreaks.
Oh, wow.
Record-keeping just could not keep pace with industrial expansion, resulting in massive bank ledger fraud.
So it's basically a structural mirror to today's data breaches and surging health crises.
Exactly. And when the official mechanisms of society failed back then, The legal system was forced to adapt to the reality on the ground.
How did it adapt?
Well, historically, society operated on express contracts. Those are formal, government-granted papers with explicit terms. But in the 1880s, when courts became utterly clogged and administrators grew corrupt, those pieces of paper became unreliable.
Right, they didn't mean anything anymore.
Yeah, so this forced a shift toward implied in-fact contracts and the reliance on a legal concept called quantum meruit.
Quantum meruit, which means what exactly?
It translates roughly to as much as he deserved.
Yeah.
The courts recognized that if the state's bureaucratic machinery was broken, they had to look at the actual behavior of the parties involved.
Okay.
If a service was rendered and a benefit was received continuously, the law implied a contract existed, regardless of whether a competent clerk had stamped a piece of paper. The behavior itself became the binding law.
So people just acted out the law themselves, and entire communities began using this logic for preemptive defense, didn't they?
They did. Groups like the Grange for Farmers or early labor unions, they realized they couldn't rely on state courts that were biased toward railroad monopolies or industrialists.
Right.
So they started creating their own ambassador programs and internal legal codes. Historians refer to this as the institutionalizing of distrust. They essentially bypassed the state to ensure their own survival.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, though, because forming a labor union or a local mutual aid society in 1890 makes perfect sense, sure. But how does that historical theory jump to someone declaring themselves a fully sovereign legal entity today?
Well, the author uses this historical mechanism, the shift from express state contracts to implied behavioral sovereignty, to justify a massive leap into the present.
Okay.
He argues that if the state is currently in a fourth turning failure, modern citizens have the historical precedent to withdraw from the state's express contracts and establish their own sovereign legal frameworks.
Wow. And this brings us from historical theory directly onto the docket in King County Superior Court. Because just a few months ago, in January 2026, this exact strategy manifested as case number 26-2-0143-4A.
Yes.
It's a quiet title action filed by Shane Jonathan Lozenich, who identifies himself as the Prussian applicant.
The Prussian applicant, right?
Yeah, of the Hohenstein-Nixon-Wallace-Benavides lineage.
And he is claiming defense over a hereditary estate termed the Seattle-Bremerton Majorat.
What exactly is a Majorat?
A Majorat is a historical European legal concept. It defines an inalienable landed estate, specifically designed to be passed down intact through a noble lineage.
Oh, I see.
He argues this territory is governed by perpetual restrictive covenants that explicitly prohibit external government law enforcement or administrative activities.
And he is filing this right as the city of Seattle and the state of Washington are aggressively rewriting the geographical and legal map of the region. Like, he is facing threats from multiple levels of government right now.
Answer threats, yeah.
The state just passed sweeping 2026 zoning laws, specifically SB 6026, which mandates dense residential housing in commercial areas.
Right.
And that law is explicitly designed to preempt and invalidate conflicting local regulations.
Exactly. To the author, SB 6026 is the state using statutory fiat to essentially erase his private covenants. Furthermore, he is contesting the jurisdiction of massive regional superagencies.
Like the Northwest Seaport Alliance, right?
Yes, and the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. These entities operate with immense police and administrative powers over huge swaths of the region, and they are often insulated from direct voter oversight.
And the federal encroachment is even larger than that. The estate's claimed territory sits right in the middle of the EPA's $668 million Duwamish River cleanup settlement.
Which is massive.
Yeah, it brings with it heavy federal consent decrees mandating specific land use. On top of that, the Navy's Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton is undergoing a massive modernization called the Shipyard Infrastructure Optimization Program.
Or SIOP.
Right, SIOP. And that requires hundreds of thousands of square feet of land acquisition.
What's fascinating here is the legal theory he's using to fight all of this.
Yeah.
The mechanism is the Uniform Declaratory Judgments Act.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, a quiet title is traditionally utilized to settle minor boundary disputes, or clear up inheritance issues between private neighbors.
Like a fence line dispute.
Exactly. But he is weaponizing it as a preemptive structural defense. He is attempting to force a court to legally freeze his property rights, recognizing his ancient covenants before the state's new upzones and the regional superagencies can permanently extinguish his unique governance structure.
Wait, so what does this all mean in practice? Are they seriously using state property laws to tell the U.S. Navy and the EPA that their ancient Prussian covenants supersede, like, federal trillion-dollar development?
That is the argument, yeah. The legal argument is that while a city or state might delegate its own administrative powers to a superagency, it cannot unconstitutionally erase pre-existing recorded restrictive covenants that run with the land itself.
Oh, wow.
It's basically an attempt to build an impenetrable legal firewall around a physical geography.
But freezing the land with a quiet title still leaves a glaring vulnerability, doesn't it? I mean, if King County just ignores the paperwork and sends a code enforcer or health officials, the property defense eventually fails if the actual person residing there is still subject to the state's jurisdiction.
That is exactly the issue. And to truly bypass the failing state, the author attempts a profound redefinition of human identity under the law.
And this is where the strategy transitions from aggressive property defense to something entirely unprecedented. The document proposes moving away from reliance on failing government systems and establishing something called fiducia centrale.
Yes, fiducia centrale.
It is proposed as a sovereign fiduciary, allegedly backed by a massive $100 trillion settlement termed the reparation of Hohenstein value.
Right, and if we look at generational cycle theory, a fourth turning crisis usually resolves through a massive centralized mobilization of resources.
Like the New Deal.
Like the New Deal or the Marshall Plan. The author is attempting a privatized version of this. The $100 trillion injection is designed as a high-velocity reset.
A high-velocity reset.
Yeah. It theoretically clears the debts and liabilities tied to the old, incompetent system, providing the immense capital required to bypass state infrastructure entirely.
Okay, so to access this high-velocity reset, you have to operate under their sovereign identity framework, which is governed by the policy of truth and routed through a specific digital domain, which is the policyoftruth.xyz.
Right.
The mechanism of identity here is completely divorced from state issuance. It is not a driver's license. It's not a social security number or a municipal tax ID.
The underlying logic is purely contractual. If the state issues your identification, the state holds the master contract.
They own you, essentially.
Pretty much. They dictate the terms, the jurisdiction, and the revocation. And as the author's initial headlines pointed out, state-issued data is highly vulnerable to breaches. The proposed framework removes the state from the contractual loop by anchoring identity in biology and mathematics.
Which is mind-blowing. It begins with what they call the Z-axis. A birth date is no longer treated merely as a day on a calendar recorded by some county clerk. It translates into a specific visual and vibrational frequency.
Right.
If you were born on a specific day, your identity is mathematically tied to a hex code, like hash ABD822, which corresponds to the color electric lime.
And the framework extends into deep biological markers, too. They utilize DNA haplogroups, citing examples like R-CTS822, one treating them as internal biological firmware.
Biological firmware.
Yeah. They even classify an O-negative blood type as a universal root protocol.
Wow.
It acts as an absolute biological shield against institutional health mandates or treatments.
It's essentially turning your literal DNA, your blood type, and the exact frequency of your birthday into a cryptographic, immutable blockchain.
Exactly.
By hard-coding identity into proprietary biology, you eliminate the state's standing to make a contractual offer. Like, a quasi-governmental state cannot hack your haplogroup, they cannot breach your Z-axis, and they cannot legislate away your blood type. You own your data root.
And by establishing that the state cannot mathematically or biologically identify you through their failing administrative machinery, the state loses its jurisdiction over your person.
The individual transitions from a managed citizen to a sovereign node.
A sovereign node, yes.
So the theoretical structure is complete, right? We have historical justification via the fourth turning, a quiet title to freeze the land rights against zoning laws, and a biological identity framework to freeze personal jurisdiction.
Right.
Yet, a theoretical shield doesn't stop a physical bulldozer, or a local police precinct that simply refuses to recognize your Z-axis frequency. How does this framework actually enforce its sovereignty on the ground in King County?
Well, the documents outline a climax to this legal strategy that relies on a staggering jurisdictional loophole.
Okay.
It is a plan to legally remove the physical land from King County's jurisdiction by fundamentally altering the ownership structure through a tenancy in common.
a tenancy in common, or a TIC, which is a standard real estate mechanism. It allows two or more parties to hold fractional ownership of a property.
Right, very standard.
But he isn't naming a corporate trust or a wealthy investor as his co-tenant. He is attempting to form a tenancy in common with the Swedish Armed Forces.
Yes.
Wait, the actual Swedish military?
The actual Swedish military. The choice of the Swedish Armed Forces is highly specific and calculated. In December 2023, the Swedish Armed Forces signed a comprehensive defense cooperation agreement with the United States.
Okay.
This international bilateral treaty grants the Swedish military specific access, operational rights, and legal protections within U.S. territory.
Which sets up a direct, intentional collision with Washington state law.
Exact.
Specifically, the 2025 Military Entry Law, HB 1321. That legislation explicitly prohibits any armed military force from another state or territory from entering Washington for duty without the explicit permission of the governor.
And HB 1321 was designed to consolidate the governor's authority over military presence within state borders. By attempting to form a real estate partnership with a foreign military, especially on land geographically adjacent to sensitive federal sites like the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, the author is forcing a massive jurisdictional paradox.
Because a private citizen creating a real estate footprint for a foreign military immediately triggers federal oversight, right?
Yes, exactly.
It forces a review by CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which monitors national security implications of foreign transactions.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, once CFIUS is triggered, the federal supremacy doctrine is invoked.
Right.
The author's strategy hinges on the gamble that the federal government's jurisdiction and the international bilateral treaty rights of the Swedish Armed Forces will completely override local municipal zoning laws and the state's military entry regulations.
So the local laws just vanish.
Basically, if an international treaty-based tenancy takes precedence, the authority of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority or the city's SB 6026 density mandates are instantly nullified on that piece of land.
It is a deliberate weaponization of institutional complexity. He is using the federal government's own international defense treaties to nullify the state governor's control over his own driveway.
It really is.
It is a brilliant, if highly dubious, attempt to hack the hierarchy of laws, replacing local authority with international treaty-based tenancy.
Although, whether Washington courts will entertain a quiet title that attempts to invoke foreign military treaties to bypass local covenants is a severe legal uphill battle. Courts generally void covenants that attempt to unduly restrict standard government action or public policy.
Sure, but the ultimate success in court almost feels secondary to the sheer audacity of the blueprint.
Definitely.
And it reveals why you, the listener, should actually care about a hyper-specific property dispute happening in the Pacific Northwest. We are all feeling the tension of a glitching system. When unemployment data is continually exposed and local municipalities seem paralyzed by housing or health crises, the desire to reclaim control is pretty universal.
Absolutely. The instinct to build a digital garden or a localized sanctuary outside of a broken system is a totally rational response to institutional decay.
Yeah.
This specific master plan simply pushes that rational response to its absolute, most extreme logical conclusion, testing the breaking point of modern property and identity law.
It really forces a radical reevaluation of what ties us to the state. But it leaves us with a very provocative mechanism to consider. If identity truly becomes decentralized, hard-coded into our biology and private digital ledgers, backed by massive private trusts as this document proposes, what happens to the people who actually want or need to rely on a traditional government safety net?
Right, the populace that cannot secede.
Exactly. If this great unraveling succeeds for those with the legal acumen and the resources to weaponize international treaties, do we end up with two entirely separate human species living side by side? One governed by the failing algorithms of the state, and one governed entirely by their own biological sovereignty. It is definitely something to think about.